The VTC meeting of the Security Council is called to order. I should like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to, on behalf of the Council, to His Excellency Mr. José Singer-Weisinger, Special Envoy of the Dominican Republic to the Security Council, for his service as President of the Council for the month of April. I am sure I speak for all members of the Council in expressing deep appreciation to Ambassador Singer-Weisinger and his team for the great diplomatic skill with which they conducted the Council's business last month. Thank you, Jose. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in Libya. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Libya to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Ms. Fatou Bensouda, Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Prosecutor Fatou Bensouda. Madam, you have the floor. Please unmute your microphone. We don't hear you. When you move the cursor on the screen, then the microphone becomes visible. Yes, that's good. Can you restart, please?
Very well. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, given the exceptional circumstances in which we currently find ourselves due to the COVID-19 pandemic, I am pleased to appear before this Council via video conference to deliver my office's 19th report on the situation in Libya, pursuant to Resolution 1970. I congratulate Estonia on assuming the presidency of the Council for the month of May and express my gratitude to the Council for facilitating today's remote briefing. Allow me at the outset to also express my condolences to Council members and indeed all members of the United Nations family for the untimely deaths of their respective citizens caused by this global pandemic, and express our solidarity in the fight to contain the spread of the virus. Relatedly, let me also emphasize that despite some inevitable limitations caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, my office's Libya team is forging ahead with its judicial work and investigations, managing to remain active and productive in these exceptional times. The Libya situation remains a priority for my office, and I seize the opportunity in this forum to announce that my team is working on applications for new warrants of arrest. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, this Council is well aware that since my last report, serious violence related to the armed conflict in Libya, particularly in and around Tripoli, has regrettably not abated. It is now over a year since the offensive on Tripoli by the eastern-based militia known as the Libyan National Army, headed by General Khalifa Haftar, started. My office continues to carefully monitor the unfolding events. Of particular concern to my office are the high numbers of civilian casualties, largely reported to be resulting from airstrikes and shelling operations. My team continues to gather and analyze information about incidents that have occurred during the recent period of armed conflict that may constitute crimes under the Rome Statute. I reiterate that intentionally directing attacks against the civilian population or against individual civilians not taking direct part in hostilities is a war crime under the Rome Statute. Likewise, the Rome Statute prohibits the intentional directing of attacks against hospitals and other buildings protected under international law, such as those dedicated to religion or education, when they are not military objectives. Even where military targets are involved, the principle of proportionality applies. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, I have previously also highlighted to your attention the issue of arbitrary detention and serious mistreatment of migrants and refugees attempting to transit through Libya. This is a grave and persistent problem, and my office continues to dedicate resources to investigating this matter. In particular, important progress has been achieved through the adoption of a cooperation strategy by my office, which focuses on the exchange of evidence and information with relevant states and organizations. This activity is conducted with a view to seize synergies and support investigations and prosecutions in domestic jurisdictions. With these efforts, I am pleased to report, are producing helpful results. It is worth stressing that the issue of arbitrary detention and serious mistreatment of detainees affects not only migrants and refugees, but also thousands of other people detained in prisons and detention centers across Libya. Latest figures indicate that the detention of persons without due process is widespread. Many people are being detained without lawful basis or denied their fundamental procedural rights. Persons detained without the proper protection of the law are at greater risk of serious forms of mistreatment, including murder, torture, rape, and other forms of sexual violence. Information obtained by my office indicates that such crimes are all too common. Former detainees report brutal methods of torture. Detention-related victims of rape and other forms of sexual violence include men, women, and children. Detainees have died from injuries sustained through torture and from the failure to provide proper and timely medical care. My office is aware of allegations of serious violations in many prisons and detention facilities throughout Libya. Of particular note are Al-Kuwaifiyah and Gernada prisons located in eastern Libya. These allegations also extend to Mitiga prisons in Tripoli, which is controlled by an armed group known as the Special Deterrence Force. This group officially falls under the authority of the Ministry of Interior of the Government of National Accord. Serious and urgent reforms in many Libyan prisons and detention facilities appear necessary to prevent future crimes. Accountability for alleged crimes, past violations, is equally important. Primary responsibility for investigating and prosecuting these alleged crimes rests on Libya. My office continues to closely follow up on these allegations. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, reports received by my office also indicate increasing number of cases of enforced disappearance committed with close to total impunity. The crime against humanity of enforced disappearance entails the refusal to provide information on the fate or whereabouts of persons who have been arrested and detained by a state or political organization or with its authorization, support, or acquiescence. The crime of enforced disappearance inflicts severe suffering on the family of the missing person. It can also spread terror within a society. When targeted against prominent members of the community, such as political activists, human rights defenders, and journalists, it sends a strong message that voices of dissent will not be tolerated. For these reasons and others, the crime of enforced disappearance has grave consequences for both individuals and communities. And emblematic of this disturbing trend is the case of Ms. Siham Sergewa, a member of the Libyan House of Representatives. Ms. Sergewa has been missing since the 17th July 2019, when armed men allegedly kidnapped her from her home in Benghazi. Her fate and whereabouts remain unknown. Recent information obtained by my office may point to those responsible for Ms. Sergewa's disappearance. Investigations to verify this information are continuing. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, hate speech in Libya also appears to be on the rise. Derogatory and dehumanizing language targeted at certain individuals or groups of people is now pervasive in both traditional and social media. This is cause for concern. This type of language generates both hatred and fear in the community and deepens divisions within society. It sows the seeds for crimes against targeted groups and individuals and foments conditions in which mass atrocities, crime can occur. Under the Rome Statute, a person who instigates the commission of crimes by others is also responsible for those crimes. Such instigation can include the making of public statements inciting attacks on specific ethnic or social groups. Leaders and prominent members of the community have a special responsibility to lead by example and refrain from hate speech. Anyone who incites fear, hatred, and division in the community causes harm, not only to those targeted, but also to the society as a whole. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, I turn now to the case of Mr. Saif al-Islam Gaddafi. The second round of litigation in relation to the admissibility of Mr. Gaddafi's case has now concluded. On 9th March 2020, the appeals chamber unanimously ruled that Mr. Gaddafi's case is admissible before the International Criminal Court. Accordingly, the arrest warrant for Mr. Gaddafi remains enforceable. Libya continues to be under an obligation to arrest and surrender Mr. Gaddafi to the court. In its judgment, the appeals chamber found that the International Criminal Court is barred from trying someone who has already been tried in a national jurisdiction with respect to the same conduct only if the proceedings in the other court are final. The Libyan domestic proceedings against Mr. Gaddafi are not final. Given that he was convicted in absentia, if Mr. Gaddafi surrenders himself or is arrested, Libyan law provides that he must be retried. If sentenced to death for a second time, review by the Libyan Court of Cassation would be mandatory. Furthermore, the Libyan amnesty law, law number 6 of 2015, does not apply to this case. In the course of the admissibility proceedings, Mr. Gaddafi stated that he was released from detention on or about 12 April 2016. He has made no effort to surrender himself. Mr. Gaddafi is a willful fugitive, actively evading justice both in Libya and before the International Criminal Court. And neither case can progress, nor can the victims of Mr. Gaddafi's alleged crimes receive justice whilst he remains at large. The appeals chamber's judgment provides valuable guidance on some important points of international criminal law. Notably, Judge Ibanez Carranza, in her separate and concurring opinion, found that amnesties or similar measures that prevent the investigation, prosecution, and punishment of international core crimes that amount to grave human rights violations and grave breaches of international humanitarian law are incompatible with international law. Accordingly, Judge Ibanez Carranza found that such measures appear to be contrary to the object and purpose of the Rome Statute, although this issue must ultimately be determined on a case-by-case basis. This is a significant legal development with respect to the obligation of states to investigate, prosecute, and if appropriate, punish perpetrators of mass atrocities. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, allow me to also recall that the arrest warrants for Mr. Al-Tuhami Khaled and Mr. Mahmoud Al-Werfali are yet to be executed. The Arab Republic of Egypt, where Mr. Al-Tuhami is believed to reside, has not arrested and surrendered him to the court. General Khalifa Haftar's Libyan National Army has neither facilitated the arrest and surrender of Mr. Al-Werfali to the ICC, nor ensured his genuine investigation and prosecution in Libya. Mr. Al-Werfali is reported to be under the command of General Haftar. While my office continues to meet its obligations under the Rome Statute by advancing its investigations despite resource constraints and a challenging operational environment, the cause of justice cannot make further progress without the arrest and surrender of ICC suspects. This is a responsibility that neither rests on my office nor the court, but other actors in the Rome Statute system, namely the states. As I have repeatedly stated before this august body, the Council and its members also have a special responsibility to support and urge cooperation with the court pursuant to the resolution that referred this situation to my office back in 2011. Your Excellencies, I would be remiss if at the same time I do not acknowledge the excellent cooperation my office continues to receive in support of our investigations from numerous states and stakeholders, and in particular from the Government of National Accord and the Libyan Prosecutor General's Office. Nonetheless, on the most crucial cooperation matter, the arrest and surrender of ICC fugitives, the Libyan people's calls for justice remain unheeded. It is my sincere hope that this state of impunity will not remain the status quo, and that the victims of Rome Statute crimes committed in Libya will have justice. Justice for such crimes, including those I have elaborated upon today, is crucial to the rule of law and stability in Libya. Where appropriate, accountability for such crimes must extend to those in positions of authority. I take this opportunity to once again stress that military commanders may be held responsible for crimes committed by forces under their effective command and control. Military commanders have a responsibility both to prevent or repress the commission of crimes by their forces and to submit any such crimes for investigation and prosecution. In conclusion, international criminal justice is a necessary force of accountability and deterrence. These are pillars upon which stability, progress, and prosperity can be built and thrive. I call on this Council, the court states parties, and the international community more broadly to stand firmly by the ICC and its crucial mandate to end impunity for the world's gravest crimes. I thank you, Mr. President, Your Excellencies. I thank you for your attention.
I thank Prosecutor Bensouda for her briefing, and I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. And I first give the floor to Belgium, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to warmly welcome Madam Prosecutor Fatou Bensouda and thank her for her briefing. Mr. President, let me first reiterate Belgium's unwavering support to the International Criminal Court as an independent and impartial judicial institution. We express our deep concern over recent threats made against court officials and their families. The ICC and its staff can count on my country to continue to uphold and defend the principles and values enshrined in the Rome Statute, as well as to preserve its integrity. Mr. President, the continued escalation of violence in Libya, resulting in multiple incidents and attacks against the civilian population and infrastructure, with total impunity demonstrates why the ICC is needed more than ever to ensure accountability for the most serious crimes of international concern. Justice must be brought to the victims, and it is also necessary to prevent future violations of international humanitarian law. Reports of such attacks are numerous and continue to be published frequently, including the reports of attacks against civilian homes, schools, and hospitals in Tripoli. These attacks may constitute war crimes under the Rome Statute and should therefore be investigated and prosecuted thoroughly by national jurisdiction or the ICC. In this regard, Belgium welcomes the Office of the Prosecutor's significant progress in the ongoing investigations, including with respect to current hostilities. And take note that preparations are also moving ahead for possible new applications for warrants of arrest. We very much appreciate the close attention given by the prosecutor to certain crimes, like the propagation of hate speech, because of the significant impact it can have on the ground in an ongoing armed conflict, as she just explained, as well as alleged grave crimes against most vulnerable categories of victims, such as children, migrants, and refugees. Despite these efforts by the ICC, we all know that the court cannot be effective without the cooperation of all stakeholders. This is why the Security Council, this council, decided in its resolution 1970 to urge, and I quote, all states and concerned regional and other international organizations to cooperate fully with the courts and the prosecutor, end of quote. Yet, the lack of sufficient cooperation is obvious. We are pleased with the continued engagement of the competent authorities of Libya, the government of national accord, as well as some states and organizations. On the contrary, we are deeply concerned about the information in the report that other relevant parties still fail to cooperate significantly with the Office of the Prosecutor. This pertains especially to the execution of arrest warrants for ICC fugitives by Egypt and General Haftar's LNA, but also of any request of assistance submitted by the prosecutor. My delegation, therefore, once again urges all the competent authorities to facilitate the immediate arrest of the 3 suspects and to surrender them to the ICC. We also ask the Security Council to closely follow up on this and to take any appropriate measure in this respect. Mr. President, to conclude, Belgium continues to believe that the only long-term solution for Libya is political. In this context, justice for the victims and their loved ones will most certainly be an essential element. This Council cannot remain silent in the face of persistent impunity with regard to the most serious crimes which continue to be perpetrated in Libya. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I give the floor to Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Sven. And thanks to Madam Prosecutor for, first of all, the 19th report to the Security Council and also for your insightful briefing this morning. Mr. President, the ICC is a crucial pillar of a strong rules-based international order. We fully support the court, its impartial work, and the values enshrined in the Rome Statute. In 2011, this Council referred the situation in Libya to the ICC so as to ensure accountability for the most serious crimes. 9 years later, the security and human rights situation in Libya remains extremely worrisome. We commend you, Madam Prosecutor, for your unwavering commitment to bring justice to the victims of atrocities in Libya. We must not let impunity reign, and accountability is also essential for achieving a lasting, peaceful solution to the crisis in Libya. We could not agree more with your conclusion in your 19th report, where you say, it is regrettable that the arrest warrants issued by the court have still not been executed. The resulting impunity is an affront to the victims and their loved ones, as it undermines any hope of achieving a lasting, peaceful solution to the crisis in Libya, of which justice is an essential element." Unquote. Mr. President, we therefore encourage the prosecutor and the ICC to continue the investigations with regard to Libya and urge member states to execute the arrest warrant. Full cooperation and assistance of member states remain essential for the Office of the Prosecutor to fulfill its mandate and for the court to play the role in ending impunity for the most serious crimes that the international community assigned to it. It is also this Council's responsibility to ensure that its referrals are followed up and implemented. And in this context, it is encouraging to hear from Madam Prosecutor that your office is working on the applicability of new arrest warrants. We welcome Libya's commitment to justice and call for further strengthening its cooperation with the court. The competent authorities are able to prosecute the most serious crimes under international law. Until the Libyan authorities are able to prosecute the most serious crimes under international law, the ICC must step in to ensure accountability. Mr. President, as the fighting in Libya continues, the human cost continues to rise, and the report by the Office of the Prosecutor has given us and reminded us of some of the numbers that are entailed in this. Reports indicate that since the offensive started in April 19, more than 350 civilians have been killed, more than 300 injured, and 140,000 displaced. UNSMIL reports that there have been 57 attacks on healthcare facilities in 2019, causing the death of 13 healthcare workers. Attacks on civilians constitute a breach of international humanitarian law. Accountability for crimes under the Rome Statute and full respect of international law are prerequisites to sustainable peace in Libya. And it is the duty of the international community to ensure there will be consequences for the perpetrators. The absence of accountability encourages repetition of crimes. We are also highly concerned about the systematic use of sexual violence, including against refugees and migrants in Libya, as reported by you, Madam Prosecutor. Let me therefore again recall the sanctions listing criteria introduced by this Council on sexual and gender-based violence that clearly recognizes the devastating effects of these heinous crimes on peace and reconciliation in Libya. Mr. President, we note that the armed forces associated with General Haftar are responsible for the vast majority of attacks on civilians, more than 80%, according to a recent UNSMIL report. We also recall from earlier briefings by UNSMIL that the vast majority of attacks on healthcare facilities can be traced back to the LNA. The LNA's continued and blatant disregard for civilian lives calls for a response by the ICC, and we commend the ICC's work also in this regard. Mr. President, before concluding, let me state that full, continued, and steadfast support to the ICC and to the efforts of the prosecutor in establishing accountability to enforce the urgently needed respect for the rule of law remains absolutely essential. And we call on the members of this Council, and indeed on all UN member states, to support the court in its effort to end impunity and ensure accountability. Let me also again call on those who have not yet joined the Rome Statute to consider doing so. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. And now I give the floor to Tunisia.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I thank Madame Fatou Bensouda, Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, for her 19th report and her informative briefing today. I also acknowledge the presence of Ambassador Tahar Sunni, of the permanent representative of Libya, and welcome him to the Council. Mr. President, let me begin by expressing Tunisia's unwavering commitment to the Rome Statute and voicing our support to the ICC in the fight against impunity. The advent of the only permanent international criminal court has been a major achievement in the development of international criminal justice architecture. Supporting its independence and impartial work is essential to bring to account individuals responsible for the worst crimes known to humankind, and so to help prevent these kinds of crimes from being committed in the future. Mr. President, nearly a decade after this Council referred the Libyan situation to the ICC's prosecutor, prospects for justice and lasting peace in Libya remain regrettably elusive. Tunisia remains gravely concerned about the endemic cycle of violence, atrocities, and impunity in Libya, causing unspeakable suffering of the brotherly Libyan people. The report of the ICC prosecutor lists a wide-ranging spectrum of crimes allegedly perpetrated in Libya, including indiscriminate attacks on civilians, unlawful killing, torture, abduction, enforced disappearance, unlawful detention, and other serious human rights abuses, including against migrants and refugees. Tunisia reiterates its call on all parties to respect the key international humanitarian law principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution, and take constant care to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure during military operations. A sustained period of calm leading to a permanent ceasefire in Libya cannot be enough emphasized. Mr. President, Tunisia appreciates the ongoing mandated efforts of the ICC's prosecutor and her office in Libya, pursuant to Resolution 1970 and the Rome Statute, in deterring would-be perpetrators, thus contributing to prevention of future atrocities, while being mindful of the apparent lack of enforcement of ICC arrest warrants and the COVID-19 pandemic impact on its field work. Tunisia appreciates progress the Office of the Prosecutor has made towards bringing additional submissions before the ICC concerning migrant-related crimes based on flexible and evidence-based process. Mr. President, the drafters of the Rome Statute mandated the ICC to be complementary of states, acting as a last resort, giving the primary responsibility to national courts where they are willing and able to genuinely prosecute international crimes. Tunisia supports the ICC prosecutor efforts to actively encourage Libyan-led prosecutions of crimes within the ICC's jurisdictions in accordance with the complementarity scheme and taking into consideration the humbling realities of Libya's transition. We welcome Libya's commitment to justice and the continued engagement of its competent authorities with the ICC as set out in the ICC prosecutor's report, including on assistance requests. It is essential that the international community provides all needed assistance and support for empowering Libya's judicial system to enable genuine and consistent national proceedings according to the highest standards, thus further strengthening the principles of cooperation and complementarity with the court. Mr. President, in this delicate context, the most pressing priority in Libya remains a commitment by Libyan parties to a permanent ceasefire, laying conditions for the political process and the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. Tunisia reiterates its call for a comprehensive and lasting political solution based on an inter-Libyan dialogue, far from any foreign intervention that would preserve Libya's territorial integrity and sovereignty and spare its people the effect of conflict and chaos. In conclusion, let me say that Tunisia believes that in transitional contexts, peace and accountability must be seen as mutually reinforcing in a way that uses appropriate mechanisms and ultimately promotes conflict transformation, victim healing, and social harmony. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. And now I give the floor to China.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I would like to thank Madame Bensouda for her briefing and welcome Ambassador El-Soni to attend this meeting. The conflict in Libya has raging for many years, wreaking havoc on the country and its neighbors, bringing enormous suffering to the Libyan people, and threatening international peace and security. The situation changes rapidly. We noted the recent announcements by relevant parties and reaffirmed that there is no military solution. China has always believed that the issue of Libya must be resolved through a political process. We welcome all the efforts conducive to lasting ceasefire and the response to the global ceasefire appeal by Secretary General, especially during COVID-19 pandemic and Ramadan. China calls upon all parties to the conflict to put the interests of country and the people first and achieve permanent ceasefire as soon as possible. Under the current circumstances, the people of Libya deserve a peaceful environment to fight COVID-19 pandemic. China supports a Libyan-owned and Libyan-led political settlement process and encourages UN and such regional organizations as AU and the League of Arab States to continue their mediation efforts and form synergies. We call on all member states to implement arms embargo strictly, while respecting Libya's independence, unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. The international community should continue to provide assistance to Libya so that the country achieves peace, stability, and development as soon as possible. With regard to the International Criminal Court, China's position remains unchanged. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. And now I give the floor to South Africa.
Mr. President, I know you spoke on our behalf when we thank Jose and the distinguished delegation of the DR for a good job they did in April, so I will not repeat that. But count on our support, President, as we preside over the Council deliberations for May. Mr. President, South Africa expresses its appreciation to the Prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, for her 19th report and briefing provided today on the situation in Libya. We also like to welcome our brother Taher, the PR of Libya, to today's Security Council deliberations. Mr. President, South Africa continues to support the implementation of Resolution 1970, which, apart from imposing a vital arms embargo, also mandates the ICC to investigate war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in the context of Libya since 15 February 2011. We note with concern that the non-execution of arrest warrants for ICC fugitives remains the greatest obstacles faced by the prosecutor and her team. Cooperation between Security Council and state parties to the REM statute is vital to advance those cases, and we send a message to the people of Libya and to the world, underscoring the important role of international cooperation. South Africa ardently supports strengthening complementarity through the development of domestic institutions to investigate and prosecute the most serious crimes. Mr. President, South Africa commends the prosecutor's efforts to promote the investigation and prosecution of international crimes committed in Libya in its domestic jurisdiction where viable and appropriate. South Africa believes that cooperation with the ICC remains imperative, and South Africa is encouraged by the continued engagement of the Libyan authorities and their commitment at the highest level to cooperate with the Office of the Prosecutor. We further welcome assistance provided to the Prosecutor's Office by international and regional organizations, civil society groups, and private individuals. Mr. President, South Africa believes that progress in the Libyan peace process is vital in order to address the concerns that necessitated the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1970, of which the ICC process is part. We remain concerned over the ongoing fighting in Libya, including the resultant displacement of people, indiscriminate attacks that causes damage to civilian property and infrastructure, as well as civilian death and injuries, in particular, deaths and injuries of children. We have noted with deep concern, Mr. President, the reports on the escalation of an abduction and enforced disappearance of journalists, civil society activists, lawyers, migrants, and state officials by armed groups during this COVID-19 outbreak, which have a negative effect on the spreading of the virus to those affected. There is also concern, Mr. President, about the report of migrants being subjected to arbitrary detention, unlawful killing and forced disappearance, torture, sexual and gender-based violence, abduction for ransom, extortion. We are concerned about the prevailing environment and challenges faced by the people of Libya and the Office of the Prosecutor as a result of COVID-19 pandemic, which will require a pragmatic and condition-based approach for the expeditious finalization of investigations and prosecution of the international crimes committed in Libya. Mr. President, South Africa welcomes efforts undertaken to implement strategic Goal 6 of the Office of Prosecutor Strategic Plan for 2019-2021, of actively engaged with state and relevant organizations to exchange evidence and information, and which support national authorities to investigate and prosecute migrant-related crimes in their respective jurisdictions. South Africa calls on all parties and stakeholders to commit and recommit all efforts towards building durable peace in Libya on the basis of inclusive political dialogue as the only viable means to achieve sustainable peace in Libya. We also acknowledge and emphasize the role of your Security Council in promoting political dialogue and supporting all efforts to bring a peaceful settlement of this crisis. Finally, Mr. President, we hope to witness continued UN and OAU collaboration in Libya, as well as early appointment of UNSG envoy to inject oxygen in the political process toward a peaceful, inclusive, and stable Libya. I thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now give the floor to the Dominican Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Prosecutor Bensouda for her report on the pending cases and the updates on the current situation in Libya. The Dominican Republic would like to express its condolences to all the victims and their families from the recent violence in Libya caused by the Libyan National Army's offensive last month. we strongly reiterate the importance to protect civilian infrastructure, historical monuments, and religious buildings. Health systems around the world are collapsing due to COVID-19 pandemic, but hospitals are still being hit by indiscriminate attacks in Libya. This is intolerable. These actions reveal the importance to strengthen the cooperation between states and the International Criminal Court. Criminals must know that their terrible actions have legal international consequences. We ought to highlight the deterrent effect of this international tribunal, especially in this moment when multilateralism is facing great challenges. The fight against impunity must never stop. Mr. President, the Dominican Republic applauds the efforts of the ICC on Mr. Gaddafi's appeal case and takes this opportunity to reiterate its call to all member states to collaborate with the ICC on all pending arrest warrants. Bilateral approaches of the members of this council are essential to move forward in this regard, as well as cooperation with the Libyan authorities, state parties, other UN member states, and other relevant entities to assist the Office of the Prosecutor in fulfilling its mandate. We deeply regret that Ms. continues missing after her abduction by armed men. The Dominican Republic sees with great disappointment the escalation in disappearances of journalists, civil society, activists, lawyers, and state officials. We welcome the advances on the investigations of migrant-related crimes, those responsible for the atrocious acts against migrants in Libya, and all victims of these terrible crimes must be prosecuted and held accountable, whether by their national jurisdiction or by the ICC. The Dominican Republic echoes the call of the Secretary General Antonio Guterres for a global ceasefire. Regardless of the ideological affiliations, the people of Libya must stop fighting each other and start fighting together their common enemy, the COVID-19 pandemic. To conclude, the Dominican Republic reiterates its full support to the ICC as part of the rules-based international order in its search to guarantee compliance with international law. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is shameful that several of the most notorious perpetrators of crimes against the Libyan people this past decade continue to enjoy impunity. Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, Mahmoud al-Warfali, al-Tuhami Mohammed Khaled, and Abdullah al-Sanusi should face justice for their alleged crimes. We call on those who harbor Saif al-Islam Gaddafi and Mahmoud al-Warfali to deliver them to Libyan authorities immediately. We also call on those who shelter al-Tuhami Mohammed Khaled, the former head of Libya's notorious internal security agency, to end their protection of this perpetrator. We are monitoring the status of the Supreme Court of Libya's case against Abdullah al-Sanusi. Accountability for the architects of Libya's darkest days would bring justice to the victims of these atrocities and their families and help ensure they are not forgotten. It would also deliver a powerful deterrent message to potential future abusers and to those involved in the current conflict who may be guilty of atrocities. The U.S. government continues to receive other reports of human rights abuses in Libya occurring today. Accounts include arbitrary killings, forced disappearances, unlawful detention, torture, human trafficking, and sexual violence. The conflict in Libya is destabilizing the region and has displaced many, including migrants and refugees. Libyan militia groups and security forces on all sides, as well as their international backers, stand accused of perpetrating these human rights abuses. We are deeply alarmed and continue to call for de-escalation and a ceasefire to end these abuses and permit Libyans to address the threat posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Libya's political and security instability has created an environment conducive to the commission of human rights abuses. In an effort to address this environment, the United States continues to oppose foreign military intervention in Libya and support a rapid return to a political process. And we thank Acting Special Representative Stephanie Williams and her team for their ongoing efforts to secure a negotiated political solution to the crisis. The United States has historically been and will continue to be a strong supporter of meaningful accountability and justice for victims of atrocities through appropriate mechanisms. Perpetrators of atrocity crimes must face justice, but we must also be careful to use the right tools for each situation. I must reiterate our long-standing and principled objection to any assertion of ICC jurisdiction over nationals of states that are not party to the Rome Statute, absent a UN Security Council referral or the consent of such states. Our concerns regarding the ICC and the situation in Afghanistan are well known. Our position on the ICC in no way diminishes the United States' commitment to supporting accountability for atrocity crimes, violations of international humanitarian law, and gross violations of human rights. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, and then I'll give the floor to St. Vincent and Grenadines.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank Mrs. Fatou Bensouda, Prosecutor of the ICC, for her presentation this morning. Mr. President, in 2002, St. Vincent and the Grenadines ratified the Rome Statute of the ICC. Our position then, as it is now, was premised on the conviction that the ICC has a fundamental role to play in our collective quest for peace and justice. As we uphold the integrity of the ICC and the principles of international law, we stress the importance of investigating genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, ending impunity for perpetrators and those atrocities, and bringing justice to the victims. In Libya, the situation remains extremely worrisome and risks being further exacerbated by recent developments, including the COVID-19 pandemic. St. Vincent and the Grenadines renews its call for all warring parties to commit to a ceasefire and engage in an inter-Libyan dialogue to resolve the conflict peacefully. The escalation of violence, particularly the indiscriminate attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, only aggravate the suffering of the Libyan people, especially the most vulnerable groups. We categorically condemn these acts of violence and demand the safety and protection of civilian population in Libya. We also reiterate the importance of consolidating the United Nations three-point plan and the work of UNSMIL, and encourage all external influential actors to assist in this regard. Mr. President, the difficulties faced in Libya today, as underscored in the ICC's report, are made evident by the challenges encountered by the Office of the Prosecutor in effectively executing its mandate. St. Vincent and the Grenadines emphasizes the importance of cooperation and the principle of complementarity of the Rome Statute, which are essential for the court to assume its functions. Accordingly, we call on all states to respect their treaty obligations, cooperate with the ICC, and adhere to the principles and purposes of the United Nations Charter. We also respectfully encourage states which have not yet done so to ratify the Rome Statute. The ICC remains at the center of our international criminal justice system and is a primary mechanism to provide restitution to the victims and families of mass atrocity crimes. In closing, Mr. President, St. Vincent and the Grenadines stands in solidarity with the people of Libya and reiterates its commitment and support to the ICC, which remains a bastion of hope and justice that is critical for building and sustaining peace. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Indonesia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, Indonesia would like to thank Ms. Fatou Bensouda, the prosecutor of the ICC, for her briefing. We took note of the prosecutor's 19th report to the United Nations Security Council pursuant to its resolution 1970 of 2011 on Libya. More than a year has passed since the new conflict in Libya started, and the situation on the ground remains grim. Mr. President, allow me to focus on the following points. First, Indonesia calls for the immediate cessation of hostilities in Libya, and we should continue the path of political dialogue, since there will never be a military solution in Libya. We join UNSMIL's call for all parties to immediately halt all military operations and resume the 5+5 Joint Military Commission talks during the month of Ramadan, in line also with the call of the UN Secretary General for a global ceasefire. Second, Indonesia calls for expansions of humanitarian corridors during the month of Ramadan and welcomes the increased efforts made by UNHCR through a series of extra emergency distributions in Tripoli. Nevertheless, we remain concerned that in the first quarter of 2020, the number of civilian casualties in Libya has increased by 45% compared to the last quarter last year, amounting to at least 131 civilian casualties. During the same period, attacks on schools and healthcare facilities persist. Attacks towards health facilities will severely impact Libya's ability to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. We call on all parties to fully respect the international humanitarian law and taking measures to protect all civilians. This leads me to my last point. Indonesia is committed to pursuing justice in Libya as part of the wider efforts to achieve long-lasting and sustainable peace in Libya. Indeed, peace cannot be complete without justice, and justice cannot prosper in the absence of peace. Rule of law must be respected. To this end, we further extend our support to the work currently being done by UNSMIL. I fully share the view that it is Libya's obligation to ensure accountability for crimes committed in its territory. We need to empower the Libyan judicial authorities to enable them to exercise their full sovereignty. That is why the referral of the situation in Libya to the ICC should not disarm the Libyan competent authorities from invoking its jurisdiction to investigate gross violation of human rights and bring the perpetrators to justice. It is clear for Indonesia, the priority at hand is to save lives. Actions by the international community must be made through careful decisions to avoid provoking more violence, resulting in more loss of lives and jeopardizing the quest of peace. I thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We took note of the briefing of the ICC prosecutor, Ms. Bensouda, as well as her 19th report on the progress in the investigation of the situation in Libya. We are concerned that the situation in Libya remains tense and efforts to stabilize it have been stalled. We are convinced that military solution is not an option for Libya. but there is no easy way to settle the conflict, which is already 9 years old. It is rooted in the events of 2011, when the UN Security Council resolution was grossly distorted and violated, which led to the destruction of Libyan statehood and continued suffering of civilian population. It is our firm conviction that the way forward is returning to impartial diplomatic work, cooperation and mutual support to help parties to engage in negotiations. In this regard, we would like to remind that it must be a Libya-owned dialogue and no decision should be imposed from outside. In our work, we should be guided by the principles of respect for Libya's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. It's up to the Libyans to determine the future of their country. At the same time, it is impossible to overestimate the importance of UN's central role in the settlement in this country. We pay tribute to Ghassan Salami and call upon the Secretary General to appoint his new special representative as soon as possible for the sake of Libyan peace progress. We would also like to use this opportunity and call on all parties to the conflict in Libya for cessation of hostilities in order to enable joint approaches to the COVID-19 pandemic and respect international humanitarian law. Now turning back to the prosecutor's report. There's a big question. What is the role of the ICC in helping to restore peace in Libya and bringing perpetrators to justice? The ICC has been handling this situation for 9 years. We recall that the activities of Prosecutor was once very dynamic during the short period of time in 2011, before the foreign invasion in this country. Once Mr. Gaddafi was ousted, the ICC identified a couple of fugitives and mostly lost its interest in the situation. If one starts to evaluate the situation in Libya on the basis of the ICC prosecutor's reports, he or she may discover a number of parties to this armed conflict which go unnoticed and apparently excused. Coalition bombings and distractions are still invisible for the ICC, for the prosecutor. Even ISIL fighters, whose destructive role in this country was recognized by the Council, somehow appeared outside ICC's scope of engagement. The activities of the ICC in Libya become increasingly irrelevant. We are convinced that the international community and the Security Council should concentrate their efforts in helping to restore peace in Libya. When peace is firmly established, Libyans can decide for themselves how to address the issue of justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now I turn to Vietnam.
Mr. President, we continue to pay close attention to the situation in Libya. We are concerned that despite the agreement on the humanitarian truce in March, the security situation in Libya has worsened. Attacks on civilians continue to take place, especially targeted ones, and those on schools, healthcare facilities, as mentioned in UNSMIL's first quarter report on civilian casualties. The ongoing hostilities will only exacerbate the sufferings of the Libyan people, especially in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Vietnam is further concerned by the recent lack of progress towards a peaceful political solution in Libya. The best hope for long-term peace and stability in Libya is to achieve a political, peaceful, and long-term solution on the basis of respect for Libya's independence and sovereignty, and through an inclusive Libyan-led and Libyan-owned process in line with the three political, military, economic tracks set out in Security Council Resolution 2510 on the Berlin Conference on Libya. We reiterate the importance of dialogue instead of warfare in this difficult time of COVID-19, as well as the implementation of the arms embargo. The role of the United Nations, UNSMIL, regional organizations, and neighboring countries of Libya will continue to be crucial in promoting peace in Libya. In this connection, Vietnam wishes to stress the following. First, in the spirit of the month of Ramadan, the relevant parties in Libya should immediately stop the ongoing hostilities, uphold their commitment to the truth, fully respect international humanitarian law, stop targeting civilians and civilian objects, and allow unhindered humanitarian access to assist those in need and to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. Second, peace talks under the three political and economic tracks should be resumed as soon as possible. All supportive activities should continue, including through remote means if necessary. The new special representative of Secretary General of Libya should be appointed as soon as possible to effectively assist this process. Third, Vietnam reiterates our consistent position that the state has the primary responsibility for the implementation of international humanitarian law, the prevention and suppression of serious criminal acts such as war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression. The establishment of accountability of violation of international humanitarian law and serious criminal acts shall be conducted in accordance with the fundamental principles of international law on states' independence and sovereignty. In conclusion, Vietnam would like to reaffirm our strong support for the pursuit of peace, stability, development, and national unity of Libya. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Niger.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me first of all to welcome the holding of this briefing devoted to the consideration of the 19th biannual report on the activities of the International Criminal Court in Libya, and to congratulate Madame Fatou Bensouda, Prosecutor of the Court, for the accurate and edifying presentation. I also welcome the permanent representative of Libya to this meeting. Niger would like to assure her of its full support and to urge all states, including those that are not parties to the Rome Statute, to cooperate fully with the ICC to combat impunity. My country, therefore, deplores the intensification of serious human rights violations because of the deterioration of the security situation in the country, which must continue to draw the attention of the Security Council and the ICC. Indeed, only in a stable security environment will there be more effective cooperation between Libya and the ICC. We note with regret that arrest warrants for Libyan nationals have not been executed to date, owing in particular to the current security context, and therefore call on the Libyan authorities, states parties to the Rome Statute, and regional and international organizations to comply with Council Resolution 1970 by cooperating fully with the ICC to bring the alleged perpetrators of crimes before the competent international courts. My delegation holds the beliefs that the fight against impunity must be an integral part of the national reconciliation process in order to create the conditions for lasting peace in Libya. According to the reports referred to by the prosecutor of the court, migrants and refugees in Libya are regularly victims of arbitrary detentions, assassinations, enforced disappearances, torture, sexual and gender-based violence, kidnapping for ransom, extortion, and forced labor. We therefore call on the competent Libyan authorities and the Office of the Prosecutor to continue to conduct investigation to establish responsibility for ensuring justice for the victims. Mr. President, the security situation in Libya has deteriorated considerably due to the continued fighting between the forces of Marshal Khalifa Haftar and those of the Government of National Unity led by Prime Minister Fayez al-Sarraj, and despite the current COVID-19 pandemic. My delegation is concerned about reports of attacks that have resulted in the loss of civilian lives in Libya and the destruction of civilian infrastructure. We reiterate our call for compliance with the arms embargo. The arms that are pouring into Libya not only contribute to prolonging the Libyan conflict, but also fuel all the sources of insecurity, as the case in the Sahel and the Lake Chad Basin. Mr. President, my delegation would like to join the Bureau in welcoming the appointment of Ms. Stephanie Williams as Special Representative of the Secretary General and Acting Head of the United Nations Mission of Support in Libya, and to congratulate Mr. Ghassan Salamé on all the actions undertaken and effort made during his tenure. We commend the excellent work done by UNSMIL, which is providing valuable assistance to the ICC investigations. In conclusion, my delegation would like to reiterate its congratulations and support to Prosecutor Bensouda and her office for their dedication to the fight against impunity, the establishment of the rule of law, and the deterrence for new crimes. We would like also to call on the United Nations, and particularly the Security Council and the African Union and other stakeholders, to combine their efforts to bring about an early end to the clashes so that peace can be restored in Libya and in the Sahel region. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, it's a pleasure to see the Prosecutor, Madam Bensouda, with us today, albeit in a slightly different format from we're used to. I'd like to thank the Prosecutor for briefing us on her 19th report to the Security Council on the situation in Libya. The United Kingdom strongly supports the work of the International Criminal Court to tackle impunity and hold accountable those responsible for the most serious crimes in Libya. The Court's work is of vital importance, especially given the continued flagrant breaches of international humanitarian law, including the ongoing targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure, and violations and abuses of international human rights law. It is particularly appalling at a time when countries are facing an unprecedented shared threat from COVID-19 that healthcare facilities are among the civilian infrastructure apparently being deliberately targeted. Civilians, including migrants and refugees, are paying an unacceptable price during this conflict. The United Kingdom is clear in its view that civilians should be protected in armed conflict, and when they are targeted, including through sexual and gender-based violence, those responsible for violations of the law should be held accountable. The United Kingdom will continue to support the ICC in the crucial role it has to play in making this happen. We welcome the progress that the Prosecutor is making in her investigations, including her work on new warrants. Mr. President, the United Kingdom is grateful for the Prosecutor's updates on the cases against Mr. Gaddafi, Mr. Arwar Fali and Mr. Al-Toumi. We note the rejection of Mr. Gaddafi's appeal by the ICC's appeal chamber when it upheld the decision of the pre-trial chamber and dismissed Mr. Gaddafi's admissibility challenge. We note with particular concern reports of Mr. Arwar Fali's continued involvement in serious crime 3 years after the first arrest warrant was issued for him. We continue to support the Prosecutor's call for all relevant states, including states parties to the Rome Statute and non-states parties, to cooperate with the ICC in the arrest and surrender of warranted individuals. Mr. President, we note the reports of escalating violence in and around Tripoli, leading to the death, injury and displacement of significant numbers of civilians. Reports of shelling and airstrikes that may constitute a violation of international humanitarian law are especially worrying. It is not acceptable that civilians, including migrants and refugees, remain at risk. This is why it is imperative that all parties cease fighting. The United Kingdom notes the references in the prosecutor's report once again to indiscriminate abductions, arbitrary detentions and extrajudicial killings. These are unacceptable. We are particularly concerned that MP Siham Sergawa remains missing, and we are pleased that the ICC's investigations continue. Mr. President, it is clear that the ongoing conflict is having an unacceptable impact on the humanitarian and human rights situation in Libya. We continue to urge the Libyan parties to cease fighting and engage in constructive dialogue. An inclusive political solution, as set out by the Berlin Conference, offers the best hope for the stability and future prosperity of the Libyan people, which they need and deserve. We continue to call on all parties to the conflict to comply with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. Support for international criminal justice remains central to the United Kingdom's foreign policy. We continue strongly to support the mission of the ICC, including getting justice for victims, and are committed to continuing to provide our full support to the prosecutor and her team in their ongoing investigations in Libya. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, and I'll give the floor to France.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. I also want to thank Prosecutor Bensouda for her report and her presentation, and it's a pleasure to see her even virtually. France fully supports the International Criminal Court, which must be able to act independently and impartially within the framework of the Rome Statute. The prosecutor and her team must be able to exercise her prerogatives without obstructions and impediment. Justice for victims of mass atrocities is one of the key factors to resolving the conflict in Libya. This is why Security Council referred the Libyan situation to the ICC back in 2011 in Resolution 1970. Unfortunately, violations of human rights, humanitarian and refugee law are widespread. Targeted attacks against the civilian population and against medical infrastructure may constitute war crimes under the Rome Statute, as the prosecutor well recalled. Trafficking in person and smugglings of migrants, arbitrary detentions, mistreatment of detainees, enforced disappearances, torture and sexual violence are unacceptable. There can be no doubt that anyone who incites or commits such crimes today in Libya is liable to prosecution, whether by the Libyan justice or by the ICC. In this regard, France welcomes the rigorous approach adopted by the Office of the Prosecutor based on the principles of cooperation and complementarity with domestic courts. We take note that the appeal chambers of the ICC confirmed the admissibility of the case against Saif Islam al-Qaddafi. We commend the cooperation between the Office of the Prosecutor and the Government of National Accord at the highest level, including as regard the execution of the requests for assistance. However, as others, we are deeply concerned by the obstacles the Office still faces in the execution of the arrest warrants for 3 fugitives. Full cooperation from all stakeholders is required, first and foremost from the Libyan parties. France will continue to cooperate with the ICC and call on all states, whether or not party to the Rome Statute, to do the same. Moreover, France welcomes the assistance provided to the office by UNSMIL. Finally, we reiterate that the most serious crimes committed in Libya since 2011 and which continue to be committed today must all be investigated and prosecuted, including the crimes committed by extremist and terrorist groups, and crimes against refugees and migrants. Mr. Chair, only a political solution and the restoration of the rule of law can put an end to the Libyan crisis and avoid further degradation on the ground. The Libyan parties must immediately and sustainably cease the hostilities and engage in the UN-led dialogue. In this regard, we welcome the recent proposal made by the Libyan National Army to declare a truce for the month of Ramadan. We also call on the GNA to take the same commitment. Both parties must endorse and sign the draft ceasefire agreement, which was agreed in the 5+5 committee on February 23rd. In that context, the swift nomination of a new special representative is essential. I thank you.
Thank you very much, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Estonia. I thank Madam Prosecutor for her report and today's informative briefing. At the outset, I would like to affirm Estonia's strong support to the International Criminal Court as an independent and impartial judicial institution and an important pillar of rules-based international order. I welcome the update provided by the prosecutor on the status of current cases and the progress achieved in the Libya investigations during the previous reporting period. We recognize the security and COVID-19 pandemic-related challenges that affect the work of court in Libya. Regarding developments on the ground, Estonia is worried about the rise in civilian casualties by 45% in the light of escalation of violence in the first quarter of 2020. We condemn the indiscriminate use of shelling and airstrikes causing death and injury to civilians, and the incidences of arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, torture, and extrajudicial killings. We are further concerned about reports of crimes against migrants and refugees in Libya. We want to remind that attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure may constitute a war crime under the Rome Statute. Estonia calls on parties to conflict to respect international humanitarian law and human rights law. As others, Estonia is highly concerned about the fact that there have not been any executions of ICC arrest warrants in the Libya case, leaving 3 fugitives at large. We recall that these 3 individuals are accused of the grave international crimes of murder, torture, inhuman and degrading treatment. An execution of the arrest warrants is needed to uphold justice for the victims. Ending impunity is essential for long-term peace. In this regard, we also take note of the fact that preparations are moving ahead for possible new applications for warrants of arrest. International criminal justice continues to rely on collective effort. We welcome the assistance provided to the Office of the Prosecutor by states, international and regional organizations, civil society organizations, the Libyan authorities, and the UN support mission in Libya. Ultimately, it is us, states, who have to show up and respond to the clear obligation arising from the Security Council Resolution 1970 from 2011 to cooperate with the court. Therefore, Estonia urges all states, including states that are not party to the Rome Statute, to fully cooperate with the ICC in order to end impunity and establish justice for the victims in Libya and demonstrate respect for the rule of law. Finally, let me assure you, Madam Prosecutor, of Estonia's full support to the work of the ICC in pursuing accountability in Libya. Thank you. And I now resume my function as the President of the Council. Madam Prosecutor, would you like to respond to some of the comments that you heard now?
Unmuted, yes. No, I have lost it again.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, with your indulgence, I wish to briefly just retake the floor to express my most sincere appreciation for the declarations of support from the members of this Council on the need for accountability in Libya and the work of my office to achieve this goal. We are encouraged by today's briefing and remain steadfast in our commitment to the situation in Libya. That expression of gratitude also extends to those Council members who, in this forum, have once again acknowledged the importance of the ICC to fight against impunity for the world's gravest crimes and to a rule-based international system and reject any effort to undermine its independence and crucial work. The ICC is a judicial institution that, as a court of last resort, offers hope to victims of atrocity crimes who might otherwise have no access to justice. As prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, I took an oath before the world to independently and impartially undertake my mandate under the Rome Statute. My office and I will continue to undertake that statutory duty with utmost commitment and professionalism. And as we do, we continue to count on your support. And I thank you, Mr. President, Your Excellencies, once again.
Thank you, Madam Prosecutor. I now give the floor to the representative of Libya.
Thank you, Mr. President. And in the beginning, I would like to congratulate you for assuming presidency of the Security Council for this month. I would also like to thank Ms. Bensouda for her briefing and thank her and her team for all the efforts they have been doing in this unprecedented times. I would like to express also our condolences to all your countries and the countries of the world with the loss of lives during this pandemic. Ladies and gentlemen, achieving justice over all Libyan territories is a responsibility that falls within Libyan sovereignty and national jurisdiction. However, we reiterate our continued cooperation with the International Criminal Court in accordance and with relevant Security Council resolutions as a complementing role, which has been highlighted by Ms. Bensouda on many occasions and various reports. However, we still believe in the mandate of the national judiciary system to prosecute all of the accused in accordance with Libyan Penal Code that reflects Libya's sovereignty over its territory and citizens. The Libyan judiciary is further committed to ensure a fair and impartial trial for all those wanted, including the fugitives and the outlaws. The national judiciary system is determined to prosecute all those committed any type of violations on Libyan soil, and these crimes shall not be subject to statute of limitations. In this regard, we would like to emphasize that the Libyan judiciary system monitors all violations and crimes, in particular, those committed by war criminal Khalifa Haftar since the attack on Tripoli and its outskirts on 4th of April 2019. In addition to the numerous violations he committed in other cities of Libya, including but not limited to kidnapping, killing and public executions, as in Benghazi in the east, and the Merzak massacre in the south, and the massacre on the military school students in Tripoli in the west, in addition to many others. In this regard, the military prosecutor in Libya issued a warrant for the arrest of a number of criminals and outlaws. First and foremost is war criminal Khalifa Haftar and other leaders under his command. We also wish to inform you that my government is finalizing a third report issued by the Joint Committee for Monitoring and Documenting Human Rights Violations in accordance with GNA Decree 735/2019, and this report will be shared with the ICC and the Security Council soon. As stated in Ms. Bensouda's briefing today, which covers the past 6 months and her previous 17th and 18th reports, Haftar's forces were explicitly accused of numerous war crimes, from airstrikes, indiscriminate bombing of civilians and civilian facilities, to other serious violations. The latest of those crimes, for example, is the bombardment on Al-Hadba Hospital in Tripoli, 7th of April, assigned to treat COVID-19 patients, which caused the closure of the hospital several times and resulted in terrifying patients and medical staff. Adding to that, shutdown of water, gas, and electricity supplies to the city. These violations were firmly condemned by the Secretary General of the United Nations and many other countries, which comes at a time when the entire world is facing anxiety and panic due to this pandemic, to add another tragedy to the existing crisis faced by civilians in various sectors of life in my country. As for the concerns expressed in the report on the situation of illegal migrants, we would like to emphasize that my government has taken a number of swift measures to protect them, expediting their transfer from conflict areas, and is cooperating with specialized UN agencies to monitor their living and medical conditions. However, this may not be sufficient enough, since Haftar and his militias deliberately target their detention centers, as what happened previously by an airstrike on Tajura Center last July 2019, killing 53 migrants and injuring 130, as mentioned in ICC last report. Ms. Bensouda, we thank you for your reports and findings in an effort to uncover war crimes and crimes against humanity in Libya, and to hold the perpetrators accountable, as you always said. But the question on the table now is, what's next? What are you going to do after all these findings and evidence that you have listed today and in previous reports? What is ICC waiting for to hold accountable all those responsible for these violations that was indicated today and have been committed by the so-called National Army? By the way, I agree with you, as you named it. It's a militia that calls itself a national army. And in this regard, I really request all of you in the Security Council and ICC, for legal purposes, not to call it the National LNA or Libyan National Army, because that's not even the name they call themselves. So now, who's responsible? According to Article 28 of the Rome Statute, I quote, "A military commander or person effectively acting as a military commander shall be criminally responsible for crimes with the jurisdiction of the court committed by forces under his or her effective command and control, or effective authority and control as the case may be, as a result of his or her failure to exercise control properly over such forces." We might ask, for example, what is the difference between your swift actions taken against Mahmoud al-Warfalli for his crimes according to the evidence you found, who is, by the way, being promoted by Haftar and currently fighting in the outskirts of Tripoli? So what's the difference between what Warfalli has been doing and Haftar massive crimes against humanity and human rights violations, targeting and killing thousands of innocent people, where many of these crimes he and his commanders publicly committed and admitted? According to Article 7 of the Rome Statute, I also quote, "Crimes against humanity means any of the following acts when committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against any civilian population, with the knowledge of attack, as murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, or forcible transfer of population." End quote. And this is only some of Haftar's crimes that were committed, as stated in your report. And another question that awaits an answer: what about the countries and officials outside Libya who support and finance these grave violations? Isn't this a joint responsibility? What about the use of mercenaries from several nationalities to conduct these violations, as clearly stated by name in the Security Council Sanctions Committee reports? What about the countries that finance and provide arms contributing to these human rights violations? Ms. Bensouda, ICC isn't a human rights organization to just list violations and crimes. ICC has the mandate to investigate and prosecute. So based on the above and my questions, we hope that ICC will work in cooperation with the Security Council, sanctions, and panel of experts committees, so the evidence and findings are consistent, and that the accused are clearly and explicitly identified to hold them all accountable. Ladies and gentlemen, although this is an ICC briefing, I would like to remind this Council of its responsibilities towards my country, and the importance of taking a firm stance in favor of justice and accountability. As you all are aware, the aggressor continues his attacks despite his false announcement of a humanitarian truce days ago, where immediately after that announcement, he deliberately targeted civilians in the center of Tripoli and other areas, as he did, for example, in the area of Znata, killing and wounding dozens, ignoring and disregarding your efforts and previous initiatives and calls, as in Moscow and Berlin and others. Furthermore, he announced a week ago his coup on the political agreement and all the legitimate state institutions, and proclaimed himself the ultimate military ruler and tyrant of the country in an outdated, farcical performance. Hence, following the recent events, is any of you still hesitant to consider him an obstructionist and spoiler to the peace process and the resolutions of this council? Is anyone still hesitant to name and shame this aggressor and war criminal by name? When will he be held accountable? Until now, I'm hearing from all of you generic words, as if the person who is committing these attacks and these violations and massive violations is just a ghost. Nobody is naming him, even today. Ladies and gentlemen, we still reserve our legitimate right for self-defense and protect our people, and to strike all sorts of aggressors and outlaws who act as a threat to our civilians. After more than 1 year, it's obvious that this warlord military adventure has proven its failure, and the world witnessed the beginning of cleansing and curing the country from the real pandemic that is threatening peace and stability in Libya and the region. Thanks to our Libyan National Army and our valiant forces and the resilience of our people. Meanwhile, we were and still are extending our arms to all Libyans across the country who have embraced the path of peace, stability, and efforts toward a democratic civil state. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.